some time ago. And I'm not sure if he's been there in Portugal on another educational event on the biosciences. I think you have as well, or no? Yes, you have.
Yeah.
So Jim is quite familiar with us, and we are really, really lucky to interact with Jim and other of his wonderful colleagues at Munster Technology University in Cork in Ireland. So about Jim, he's a passionate university teacher, and he's been doing this for 20 years. He has been designing, delivering, and assessing undergraduate and postgraduate programs. He's basically a biotech person. He's published over 100 peer-reviewed papers, and his basic field is around molecular diagnostics and the detection of treatment of human and animal diseases. However, he has a passion for creativity and innovation, and he has been really implicated in many aspects regarding innovations in teaching and learning with several innovative initiatives. Why is there another extra reason for Jim to be with us here today? Yes, there is, because he was, as I believe I can say this word, officially mandated to lead a working group on how Munster Technology University could perhaps lead and deal, I'm not sure the word is correct, with artificial intelligence, and how he has been leading this group, and therefore he has an understanding of different perspectives, of different people, of different departments, and he has that institutional perspective that we all concerned of. What should institutions do? So that's a question that Jim can probably help us answer. So he will be our first speaker, and he'll be around for maybe 25 minutes with his intervention. And then we head off to a colleague of ours, Miguel Portela. He's here with us. I'm going to do a shorter introduction because Miguel has been around and people know Miguel. He's a professor at the School of Economics, Management and Political Sciences. He's now a full professor, and he's been very active in terms of innovations. His curricular unit since AI started to be available. And so he has his experience to tell us about, and this is basically what he will bring us today. So we have someone with real experience at several levels, even at coordinating a working group at the institution. And we have a colleague of ours who has actually hands-on experience and can tell us about a bit of his experience. And I hope if we add these two participations to last week's and to what everyone else is doing, we will gradually be able to actually reflect a bit better on what we're doing. So just to remind everyone, we're going to have the presentations, then we will have a small discussion. We had a student that was going to be with us that was mandated. I'm looking to see if I can see him, but I'll find him, I'm sure, sooner or later, to actually bring in also the student perspective. And then we'll go into breakout rooms to actually talk. The first part of the session will be in English, the breakout rooms, not necessarily, as we will excuse Jim to actually do his late hours. Hopefully, as I was saying to him, going to the pub, because it's what everybody should be doing at this time of day. Just to be so that you know, Jim and Miguel were kind enough to allow us to record their sessions. So when they are going to start speaking, we will gonna start to record, and later on we'll make these recordings available on our YouTube channel so that everyone around the university can actually learn from this experience and be inspired. And I think I have no more things to say. And so I'm really, really pleased to and thankful and very, very grateful at this time of year, at this time of day to have you with us, Jim. So the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Manuel, and good evening, everyone. Thank you for taking the time to be here. It is late in the evening here, as I'm sure it is in Portugal, and there are other things that we could be doing, but it's great that we get to share some time around this topic. I'm going to keep this very informal, and more than happy to take questions and comments as I go on. As Manuel said, I'm going to cover different areas in relation to generative AI, and specifically how it impacts assessment based on some of the work that we've been doing over the last 12 months. I think it's very important to start off because we can be very much blinded by the amount of technology that is pervading society, that it is really, really important that no matter what decisions we make, that we keep education as being human-centered. we really want our students to remember the human connections during their time with us in education, and less so the technology. So it is up to us to make sure that we act as a barrier between the students and the technology, and that we help to guide them in a way that this technology can be useful, but in a very, very responsible way. So the first thing I'd just like to ask you to reflect on is how do we make sure that our future plans for education keeps everything human centered. There's a lot of talk about generative artificial intelligence in the last number of years. Now, artificial intelligence isn't new, but generative artificial intelligence is. And what is it? Well, it's simply technology, as I'm sure you're all aware now, that it generates new content. And we used to think of it 2 years ago as just technology that can generate texts, but of course it can now generate much different types of modes of content, including images, video, music, code, etc. And it does this by a prediction. It is a very sophisticated predictive algorithm that allows it to predict the next word, the next pixel, the next movie frame, etc., based on an extensive library of training data that's made available from web pages, online sources, social media. So for those of you who are maybe not so familiar with generative AI, it's important maybe to reflect on that it creates new content in the form of different formats. It is also really important for you and for your students to be aware of the most pressing concerns, and there are many. Concerns around privacy, concerns around misinformation, bias, environmental concerns, and ethical concerns. So any work that you do as a faculty or as a university, and any training material that you generate, we've made sure that we include very detailed information around the concerns as well as the benefits, but in particular the concerns that are present on this screen. I don't have time to go through all of them, obviously, but I will share the slide deck, and it is being recorded. So in terms of building content and educational resources, I think it would be useful to have a spotlight put on these in particular. Also, another thing that I think people have a misconception about is that generative AI is essentially another word for ChatGPT, and it certainly isn't. ChatGPT is what I would call the poster child of generative AI, but it's not the only one. There are many other types of generative AI models out there, including product from Gemini, Claude. Anyone who's using Microsoft products will know that Copilot is built in. This came from China back in January or February, DeepSeek, and we have Perplexity, which is probably the #1 generative AI tool in America at the minute. And these power a whole range of other types of technologies that can produce the types of modes that we saw in the previous slide. So again, if you're unfamiliar with generative AI and you think that it's just ChatGPT, it's not. There are a lot of other technologies that can do exactly the same thing. How people are using generative AI, I found this really useful survey that was done by the Harvard Business Review a couple of weeks ago, and if you were to reflect on what you think people are using generative AI for in 2025, you might be surprised to hear that the #1 use case for generative AI is for therapy, companionship, and that in itself holds a mirror up to us and our society, that we're using this technology primarily as a companion or as a therapy. And it shouldn't come as a surprise to us, because in 2024 that was the second most popular use for generative AI. Of course, there are other uses, including learning, generating code, finding purpose, etc., exploring topics of interest. But the #1 is therapy and companionship. What do students think of generative AI? Great to have students on the call this evening, and again, it shows how committed you are to embed your outputs with both staff and student contributions. I won't go through all of these, but students generally tend to see generative AI as part of everyday life, and they recognize that the academic use of generative AI is evolving. We'll hear more from students later, but I would imagine, just like ourselves, they're crying out for clear guidance. Please tell us how we can use it, when we can use it, and when it's appropriate to use it. There is a concern around employability, which we might touch on in a few minutes. They're concerned about equity, that students with more money available to them will have access to better tools. There are, as we said, ethical concerns that are growing about misinformation and deep fakes and so on. And this is why I started the talk talking about human connection, the importance of valuing human connection. And rather than being replaced by generative AI, I would see that our work will be enhanced by generative AI, but our connection and our presence in the classroom is still going to be of real importance. Skills loss is something as well we might talk about in a second. So with all that is out there in the ecosystem about generative AI, there might be a fear that humans won't be needed to do anything in the future. Thankfully, I've good news based on work that was done by the World Economic Forum for you. This is a diagram which in very, very simple terms talks about the global employment change that's going to happen by 2030. Now, every box that you see here represents 1 million jobs. Anything in blue would be jobs that are stable, so they're going to remain stable between now and 2030. Jobs on the left-hand side here are jobs that will be destroyed. But the good news is that we have much more jobs being created in green here than we have being destroyed on the left. In fact, there's going to be a net increase of 78 million jobs between now and 2030. So for universities and for graduates, I think that news is quite refreshing because all we seem to hear is that generative AI is going to take all the jobs. It won't. So we're here to talk about the impacts for education, and this is how I see it. And our working group was based around looking at this specifically. It has really forced us as educators to rethink what the purpose of a college education is. All our learning outcomes at the module level, at the program level, at the graduate development level, these are things I think that we really have to rethink and reimagine in a world of generative AI. And it is important for us to think, and this is a phrase that Philip Dawson uses quite often, someone that I would certainly look up to quite a lot as a guru in this area. And he would always say, particularly for those who are slow to adopt generative AI, he would always say, we should be preparing students for their future and not our past. So just because our education was influenced by how it was done when we came through college doesn't mean that our students' education should be influenced by the same way. So it's a little bit like this, we're here in the middle. This is our past and is particularly irrelevant to our students. What they're interested in is their future. And their future is a future that is going to embrace and use generative AI. So we have an obligation to make sure that we give them all the tools that they need. The skills that we should be prioritizing, this again is back to the report done by the World Economic Forum. This is what employers are looking for. Graduates with analytical thinking, resilience, leadership, creative thinking, motivation, technological literacy, empathy, curiosity, and so on. So I would again suggest, and this is work that we do in our own working group, is to make this known to staff who are trying to devise new modules, new learning outcomes, and make sure that these skills are embedded into any of the assessments that are being done so that the graduates will be employment ready. There are lots of newspaper reports recently showing that generative AI are already partnering with different universities all over the world, particularly to try and help to shape the way in which generative AI can be embedded into the educational platform. So again, for those who are maybe a little bit slow to adopt generative AI, the new universities in the next 5 or 10 years, I can see many, if not all of them, the same way as we have embraced learning management systems into our curriculum. I think we will also be embracing generative AI companies and technologies to be embedded into those learning management systems as well. Why are we so worried, and why has this been so disruptive? This was originally devised in 1956. It's something you're all well aware of. Almost every educational program is built around some version of this because it makes perfect sense. We want students to have these core skills. starting at a fundamental level and then working all the way up to creation. And this has worked brilliantly for 70 years or more, because all our curricula, all our courses, all our assessments are based around our ability to measure these skills in students. The big challenge, of course, the big challenge in the last number of years is that we now have an entity, it's not a human, obviously, it's an entity in the form of generative AI that can do all of this. And that's where we run into trouble in terms of assessment, because now we are in a position where we do want students to be able to demonstrate all of these, but we also have a new entity that can help students or replace students by doing this. And that's where the problems are in terms of assessment. So that's an obvious question then. What do we now do in terms of assessment when we mention generative AI? And our working group was very heavily influenced by the work of Mairead Prachka. In fact, she gave a keynote address to us as part of a seminar series that was organized by our Department of Technology Enhanced Learning. And this was part of a LinkedIn post that I highlighted last week, because in her opinion, and I would echo it 100%, is that our basic learning outcomes in every course and program must be revised for the new AI age, because we're working towards a hybrid model of generative AI and humans working together. We have this book in our own digital library in MTU, and again, a suggestion to you, if you don't have it in your university, perhaps you do, is to consider having many copies of this available to your staff. I've often thought about why we put students and why we put ourselves through the torture of assessments. Why bother? Why can't we just bring students along with us for 4 years and then shake their hands at the end and say, here's your certificate, your job is done. That's not the world we live in, because of course we have very, very good and valid reasons for assessment. It allows us to determine whether a student has met specific learning outcomes. It gives us a chance to provide feedback to students. So we're able to say, you did this really well, but you need to work more on this and work more on this. It's a very, very useful way for students to learn how to get better. It promotes metacognition, which again is something that a lot of educational experts would advocate to have more of in curricula. How do we make our students think more about how they're learning and what they're learning, and to help them to encourage intrinsic motivation? So those are the guiding principles as to why we should continue with assessment in a generative AI age. But of course, we have to change how we assess because of the threats that it brings. I'm often asked, and our working group was asked this quite a lot, whether students should be allowed to use generative AI tools to complete tasks or to complete assessments. And this is the line that we generally tend to take. If we believe that the tool will replace the learning for the student, then it's an absolute no. Excuse me. If we believe that the tool will support learning, then yes, there's a strong case to be made for integrating generative AI into assessments. And that's a very, very, I think, important decision or position to hold within a university setting, is to have a very strong line on, do we allow generative AI? If the answer is yes, then I think you then have to put guardrails in place to make sure that it's supporting learning as opposed to replacing learning. And everybody in the university has a responsibility to make that happen. What we don't want is this. I'm going to share with you a couple of studies that again have impacted our work in the working group, have influenced our work. This is a paper that came out a couple of months ago, and it talks about that horrible phrase called cognitive offloading. Not surprisingly, what it means is that if you hand over all of your cognitive function to a machine, then your ability to think, your ability to carry out cognitive activities decreases. It's called cognitive offloading. So there is, not surprisingly, a significant negative correlation between using too much AI and your ability to think critically. And that again is, I think, a very strong message to get through to academics and to get through to students who feel that generative AI will do all the work for them. Yes, it can do all the work for them, but you're paying a very heavy price by reducing your ability to think and your brain activity and your function as a result. This is another study which literally came out a couple of days ago, and it talks again about cognitive offloading or cognitive debt. I won't go into the major details of this, but it's a very, very well-designed study. And this graph here, which is one of the highlights of the study, in very, very simple terms, the study was broken into 3 groups, where students were allowed to use a large language model like ChatGPT to help them write an essay. That's the group in red. There was a group in green that were allowed to use search engines like Google to as a support tool for writing the essay. And there was a group that used their brain only. And when they look back afterwards and they asked students to quote a specific sentence from their essay, about 85% of those who use large language models couldn't quote a single sentence. Most of the students who used search engines or used their brain were able to quote at least one sentence. So that's in practice showing how handing over all of your tasks to generative AI will effectively reduce your ability to think. And that's, I think, a really important outcome. There's some great work done by Philip Dawson, and again, this has heavily influenced our work in MTU on how to advise staff. This is, I think, published about 2 or 3 months ago, and in very, very simple terms, what Philip Dawson and his team recommend is that when any university is faced with changing how we manage assessments, there's really only 2 options available to you. One is what's called discursive changes, and this means that we have a very, very strong obligation to make sure that we clearly communicate to students what is allowed and what is not allowed, what's permitted, what's not permitted within an exam. And I'll go through a few examples of that in a minute. And the other one, which is absolutely crucial, is to make structural changes to your assessments to make sure that they're robustly designed. And again, the links for all of these studies are there if you want to look back over them. So if I were to advise you in the work that you're doing, is to think along those 2 lines. How do we advise staff about the way in which they need to communicate to their students, and also how do we advise staff on the types of structural changes that need to be made. This is our Canvas module, which I'm not going to go through in any huge detail, but this is the module that we have devised as a working group, very, very simply put together. It has a number of different units, and it provides access to and information on a number of assessment briefs and guidelines based on something that I'll talk about in a couple of minutes. And it also has a series of resources. And we found that using Canvas, which is our learning management system, is a great way because staff are familiar with it. We can keep adding content, we can keep refreshing it. It's great for discussions, it's great for adding assessment material and external courses. So this is where we house all of our resources in relation to academic integrity and generative artificial intelligence. And in terms of the clearly communicated instructions, what we've done is we've adopted the AI assessment scale, which was devised by Perkins, Furse, Rowe, and McVaugh back in 2024. And rather than using what we would call a binary approach to generative AI, binary would be where some lecturers would say you can use it and other lecturers would say you can't use it. And I think that's a very bad model. We've adopted a much more nuanced or sophisticated model where we're telling our academics that we would like them to set assessments on a sliding scale of 1 to 5, where 1 is communicating to the students that you're not allowed to use generative AI in this assessment. You can write your assessment brief, but you clearly indicate this is at level 1, and a student automatically knows that level 1 means no AI. And then there's a sliding scale of a little use of generative AI, such as AI planning, AI collaboration, full AI, AI exploration. So we're trying to change the culture and change the language, because when educators will now devise an essay or a presentation or a literature review for their students in September, we're going to ask them to make sure they clearly state whether it's set at level 1, level 2, level 3, level 4, and so on. And this brings me to the final point. That's how we're recommending that the communication is standardized. The next part would be, I think, asking about what we should be assessing. So in previous work that educators have done, there's been a very strong emphasis on grading the product. In other words, you would tell your student in week 1, I want you to produce an essay in week 6, and I'm giving all of the marks for the quality of your essay. So in other words, the essay is the product. And in a generative AI world, that's obviously not a very robust assessment, because there are Gen AI tools which would produce really, really good essays. So what we're advocating, and we're helping staff do this in a series of workshops, is we're saying reward the student for the process of learning, not necessarily for the product. So maybe 20% goes for the final product, but unless a student can demonstrate that they have all the necessary tools that they need to build the product, then they're going to score really poorly. So for each one of these, for instance, there could be 10% awarded to the student if they show competency for that particular skill. So in terms of structural changes, it's working with faculties on their individual assessments to show that they can move away from assessing the product to assessing the process. Again, there are a lot of colleagues that would suggest that what you need to do is adopt what's called the Swiss cheese model. And this is, in very, very simple terms, what this means is that you introduce layers of friction between when you give the assessment brief and when you end up taking the final product back from the students. So there are a number of different layers that they find it hard to get through. The worst type of assessment, as I said, is give the assessment brief like an essay in week 1 and then collect the essay in week 6. There's no gaps or no barriers in that particular system. But we have to remember it's an arms race. This is a product which I came across, which I thought was really good. It's called Process Feedback. It's an extension that sits into Google Docs, and what it does is it records the keystrokes of the student as they're writing the essay or writing their work. So at least you can see that it is human generated. The downside, of course, is that because it's an arms race, this piece of technology came on stream a couple of weeks later. This is a second plugin that students can use, and it effortlessly simulates human typing into any platform. So even though we think we're ahead by saying we can monitor students writing their essay, this tool will make it look like the students are typing their essay. So it is what we would call an arms race. People might also think, well, why don't we just get students to record videos or do video-based presentations? This is probably a reason why that's not a good idea.
Hi everyone, so today I'm going to be talking about my essay on Pride and Prejudice.
Hi everyone, my name is Alex, and today I'm going to be talking about my essay on Pride and Prejudice.
Yeah, these students aren't real. That is created with generative AI tools. So sometimes we think, let's just get the students to record to camera and they can talk about their essay and so on. That little scary clip gives you an indication that even that isn't safe. So we have to really be imaginative in how we go about assessing our students. I'm going to leave you with this little slide. You can read it maybe in your own time, but it's just things that we have identified over the last 6 months that we feel are useful to academics when it comes to how they can improve their own generative AI literacy. The final thing to say to you, and this again is for staff members who are a little bit worried and fearful about generative AI, is that if you want to live a life that is unplugged and that you don't want to embrace generative AI, then in your personal life you can live a very detox life. You can get up in the morning, boil your kettle for coffee, you can have picnics, you can relax, you can go for walks, take it easy, read a book. But when it comes to our professional lives, because we're preparing students for their future, we have no choice but to embrace generative AI. So we can make a very clear distinction between what we do personally, whether we want to engage with it or not, and what we do professionally. And we have no choice but to engage with it professionally. And again, just to finish, this is what we want our students to remember, that it was the educators who inspired them and made them feel good about the education that they had. The technology helped, but the main thing that they remember and are inspired by would be the educators. It's been a pleasure, Manuel, and to everyone here to get a chance to share these thoughts with you. And I'm more than happy to stay around and answer any questions, or to hear maybe where you are in relation to generative AI. Thank you for your time.
Thank you for your time and for bringing us such an inspiring and synthetic and really to the point presentation that I'm sure will help us and stimulate us to think a little better. I will suggest, because you will be a bit more around, that we now hear from Miguel, and so we have a concrete example, and then maybe when we put the two of us together, we will have